My South Hedges had been 23 years in the ground. My wife Beatrix had planted the first viburnum the same summer we buried her father. The corridor was 60 feet of native viburnum, arrowwood, and gray dogwood. My career's quiet research project. 20 years of monarch counts, 3 peer-reviewed papers. On a Thursday morning in May, I walked the property line with my coffee and found the hedges brown. The drift came from the south. Her name was Sienna Whitford Hollings, HOA board president of Stowe Vista Estates, Vermont. 46, polished, blonde, certain her view of Mount Mansfield was a moral right. Mine is Theodore Sutcliffe. I am a retired University of Vermont horticulture professor. I rebuilt the corridor with a 60-foot, 20-foot tall living wall that blocks every window of her house. The federal government approved it as pollinator restoration. What would you do if a stranger killed 23 years of your work? Where are you watching from tonight? Stay with me. Beatrix and I bought the 6-acre parcel north of Stowe Village, Lamoille County, Vermont, in May of 1998. We had been married 15 years. I had just made full professor at the University of Vermont in Burlington, a 40-minute commute on the back roads, 50 in the snow. Beatrix had been a textile artist for 2 decades by then, a weaver, the kind whose pieces sold at the Shelburne Craft School and the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, and once, in 2003, at the American Craft Council show in Baltimore. We had not yet had children. We had been looking, after 15 years in a small house in Williston, for the kind of acreage where Beatrix could build a proper studio and I could build the long-term pollinator corridor I had been writing about in seminars, but had no land of my own to demonstrate. The Stowe property fit both purposes. It was sloped, south-facing, with a small spring on the west side and a tributary of the Brewster River cutting across the east. A retired dairy farmer named Eugene Holcomb had owned the property since 1962. He had not made dairy in 15 years. He had let the back 4 acres go to alder and silky dogwood. He sold us the land on a handshake and a survey for $62,000 cash, and he died 3 months later in his sleep at age 86. We named the property Holcomb's Rest in his honor. The sign hangs at the road. Beatrix carved it herself in butternut. The pollinator corridor was Beatrix's idea before it was mine. She had read, in the summer of 2001, a Yankee magazine article on monarch decline in New England. She had asked me, over breakfast on a Sunday morning, whether we could plant a corridor of native shrubs along our south property line. Not as a hedge, not for screening, but as a deliberate ribbon of late summer nectar and overwintering structure for native bees and migrating monarchs. I had told her she had just described 20 years of my research interests in one sentence. We had walked the property line that afternoon and marked 60 feet with bamboo stakes. The first viburnum went in 3 weeks later, in October of 2001, the same week her father died of a heart attack in Connecticut. She planted the second the day after his funeral, the third the day after that. By spring of 2002, we had 34 shrubs in the ground: viburnum dentatum, arrowwood, gray dogwood, silky dogwood, nannyberry, and 3 species of native rose. We added 6 more species over the next decade. By 2010, the corridor was a continuous 60-foot wall of green from May through October. By 2015, it had been the subject of 3 of my peer-reviewed papers and 2 graduate dissertations I had advised. By 2020, it supported an annual monarch breeding population I had monitored for 19 seasons, with a count of 247 cocoons that year. Stowe Vista Estates was built across the south property line in 2010 on what had been a hayfield Eugene Holcomb had leased to a Cabot dairy until 2007. 56 homes on rolling lots of 1 to 2 acres each, a stocked pond, a clubhouse, and a tennis pavilion. The development's south-facing properties, the ones immediately backing onto our corridor, had been marketed as having unobstructed views of Mount Mansfield, the highest peak in Vermont, 10 miles south. The marketing brochure had used the phrase, Vermont's tallest mountain at your back door, in a 64-point font. The marketing brochure had not mentioned the existing 60-foot pollinator corridor on the property immediately to the north. The corridor at the time the development opened was already 9 years old and 7 feet tall. The corridor was not, I want to be clear, an aesthetic project. It was research. I had begun documenting native bee occurrences at Holcomb's Rest in 2002, 2 months after the first viburnum went in. I had a hand-tabulated field log in a green write-in-the-rain notebook that I had kept current for 22 consecutive growing seasons. The notebook was, by 2023, 8 inches thick. It contained 6,411 dated observations of 73 species of native bees, 41 species of butterflies and moths, and 112 species of birds. 3 of my graduate students had written dissertations using its data. A 4th had used it to win a Switzer Foundation Fellowship in 2018. The corridor was, in the dry language of academic life, a long-term ecological monitoring site. In the wet language of marriage, it was the thing Beatrix and I had built together. Slowly, on summer evenings, in the rain, on Saturdays after church, on Sunday afternoons after we had read the newspaper. For 23 years. It was not a hedge. It was a small piece of a marriage that happened to be made of plants. Sienna Whitford Hollings moved into Lot 23 in March of 2020 with her husband Channing Hollings, a plastic surgeon at the Burlington Cosmetic Center who specialized in what one of his marketing photographs called non-surgical facial sculpting. They had paid $1.1 million cash for a 5-bedroom contemporary on the highest pad in the South Row, with floor-to-ceiling glass on the north side facing Mount Mansfield. Except the north view, of course, was the corridor we had planted in 2001. The mountain was visible only over the top of the Hedges on a clear day from the 2nd story. Sienna had bought the house in February. She had not visited the property in May. She had not seen the Hedges in summer leaf. She had, by her own later account at a small claims hearing she filed against the previous owner, been deceived about the visual encumbrance, a phrase that does not appear in any Vermont real estate statute I am aware of, but which Sienna has used in writing 17 times since 2020. Sienna had a very particular kind of personality, and I think it is worth describing it for what it was. She was charming in person for the first 3 minutes of any conversation, and corrosive for the next 30. She remembered every slight she had ever received and forgot every kindness. She drove a white Range Rover Sport. She wore tennis whites to the village dump on Saturdays. She had a particular way of saying Vermont that implied she was on temporary assignment from somewhere better. She kept a small, spiral-bound notebook in her purse, where she wrote down the license plates of cars she thought were speeding through the development. A development whose only road was 300 yards long and whose speed limit was 15 miles per hour. She had filed 16 license plate complaints with the Stowe Police Department between 2020 and 2023. None had resulted in citations. The Stowe police had eventually stopped returning her calls. Beatrix had said, over coffee one Sunday morning, "Theodore, that woman has decided the rest of us are her staff." She had been right. Sienna had decided the rest of us were her staff. The Hedges had been the first staff member she could not fire. She got herself elected HOA board president in May of 2022. She had run on a platform of view restoration and aesthetic excellence. She had won by 28-9, primarily because 11 of the South Row residents had quietly hoped her energies would solve their own view complaints. The HOA had no jurisdiction over our property. The HOA had no easements on us. The HOA had, in legal terms, exactly the same standing as any other group of strangers across a property line. Sienna treated this fact as a temporary procedural obstacle. She wrote me her first letter on the 6th of June, 2022. The letter was on Stowe Vista Estates HOA letterhead. The letter requested that I voluntarily reduce the height of the boundary vegetation to 4 feet to restore the community's contracted-for visual access. The letter offered to compensate any reasonable trimming expense. The letter was signed in blue ink with a small loopy S. I responded politely by email. I explained the ecological function of the corridor. I explained that the hedges were the subject of ongoing research. I explained that I was not interested in reducing them. I told her I respected her view interests, but that the corridor predated her purchase by 19 years and her HOA by 9 years, and that the only person whose interest had been contracted for, in 2020, was the seller of her house, who had not owned my land. She wrote me a second letter on the 20th of June. She wrote me a third on the 11th of July. She filed her first county code complaint on the 3rd of August. The complaint alleged that my non-conforming residential vegetation was creating a microhabitat hazardous to allergic residents. The Lamoille County Code Enforcement Officer who visited the property was a woman named Junie Chamberlain, 52, a former biology teacher at the Stowe High School. Junie walked the corridor with me. She took photographs. She asked me, on my front porch, whether the swallowtail butterflies on the cardinal flower were eastern tigers or spicebush. I told her spicebush. She nodded. She wrote her report. The report dismissed the complaint in 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph noted that the corridor was, by the definition in Vermont Agency of Natural Resources Bulletin 14, an exemplary native pollinator habitat installation deserving of recognition rather than restriction. Junie signed the report. She sent me a copy with a handwritten note that read, "Dr. Sutcliffe, please keep doing what you are doing." I framed the note. It hangs in my office at home. Sienna filed 2 more complaints in 2022. She filed 3 in 2023. She filed a formal request with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources to evaluate the public health implications of unauthorized native flora installations. That request was denied by an assistant commissioner I had served with on the Pollinator Protection Advisory Committee for 4 years. The commissioner, a woman named Greta Norquist, whom I had known since her doctoral defense at UVM in 2009, called me personally the day the request crossed her desk. She said in her precise voice, "Theodore, your neighbor is impressively persistent. She is also wrong about everything. Anything you need from this agency, please call me." I thanked her. I told her I hoped not to need her. I would later need her. By the spring of 2024, Sienna had filed 11 complaints against my property. She had not made meaningful eye contact with me at any point in 4 years. She had not greeted Beatrix in the village. She had once, at the small Stowe Farmers Market in August of 2023, walked past Beatrix's weaving booth without looking at it. Beatrix had told me at dinner that night, "Theodore, Sienna is going to do something stupid. You can always tell. Some people are going to do something stupid the way some weather systems are going to drop hail." I had asked her how she knew. She had said, "I know because she stopped looking at me. People who stop looking are people who have already decided what they are going to do." Beatrix was right on the morning of the 9th of May, 2024. I walked the south property line at 6:15 a.m. with my second cup of coffee. The morning was cool and clear and smelled the way Vermont May smells, of wet alder and wood smoke from somebody's last-of-the-season wood stove. I was carrying my notebook to log the first Monarch Flight Day. The first Monarch Flight Day of the year is, for me, a small annual celebration. I had been logging it for 19 years. I expected the first flight that morning because the previous week had averaged 58 degrees, and the milkweed at the corridor's east end had unfurled the day before. I reached the western end of the corridor and stopped. The first 30 feet of the corridor was brown. Not yellowing, not stressed. Brown. The leaves of the Viburnum dentatum, which had been a full, pale green 24 hours earlier when I had walked the line, were curling at the edges and falling like ash off a wood stove door. The arrowwood next to it was browning at the tips, working inward, the gray dogwood beyond, that had the particular gray-brown wilt I had taught my undergraduates to recognize in introductory plant pathology for 30 years. It was glyphosate damage, heavy concentration, foliar application within the previous 18 to 36 hours. I stood at the western end of the corridor, in my work boots and my barn coat, with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I counted, slowly, the cocoons on the unaffected viburnum across from the damage zone. There were 11 monarch cocoons. Inside each cocoon was a chrysalis I had been waiting to count for 2 months. The cocoons within the damage zone would be dead. The chrysalises inside would be dead. The first monarch flight day of 2024 at Holcomb's Rest would not happen. I had been logging that flight for 19 years. I would be logging a 0 next to 19 consecutive numbers. I walked the rest of the corridor for 90 minutes. I photographed every shrub. I marked the drift pattern. The pattern was unmistakable. A high-volume sprayer had been operated from the south side of the property line, from inside Stowe Vista Estates, between 3 and 10 yards from the line, on the previous afternoon between 3 and 5 p.m., when the wind had been from the south-southwest at 6 miles per hour. I knew the wind because Beatrix kept an anemometer on the studio roof, and we logged it daily for her dye fastness records. The drift had pushed approximately 14 feet into the corridor on the west end, where the wind had been steady. It tapered off toward the east end. The total length of corridor affected was 41 feet. I would later confirm, when the soil samples came back from the UVM Plant and Soil Sciences Lab, that the chemical had been Roundup Promax at 4 times the labeled application rate, applied with no buffer, by a person who either did not know or did not care about pesticide drift. I walked back to the house at 7:30. Beatrix was at the kitchen table with her tea. She looked at my face. She set the cup down. She said, "Theodore." "What?" I said. "She did it. 41 feet of the corridor, Roundup, yesterday afternoon." Beatrix did not speak for a long minute. Then she said, "Theodore, I want her in cuffs." I said, "Honey, better than cuffs." I called Greta Norquist at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture at 7:45. She answered on the second ring. I told her in 3 minutes. She listened. She said in her precise voice, "Theodore, stay there. Take more photographs. Do not touch anything. I am driving up. I will be there by 9. I am bringing 2 field technicians. We are going to document this as a state pesticide drift incident, and we are going to take soil and tissue samples for the laboratory. I am also going to call the Lamoille County Sheriff and the Vermont DEC, because if the drift reached the Brewster River tributary on your east property line, we have a federal Clean Water Act incident on our hands. Do you understand me?" I told her I did. She hung up. I called my daughter Eliza next. Eliza Sutcliffe is 39, a senior environmental attorney with the Vermont Natural Resources Council in Burlington, where she has been since law school at Vermont Law and Graduate School in 2009. She handles statewide land use, pollinator, and surface water cases. She picked up on the third ring. I told her in 5 minutes. She said, "Dad, I am coming up tonight. Do not let anyone on the property until I get there. Do not talk to Sienna. Do not respond to any communication from her. If she calls, route to me. I will be there by 6. She hung up. I called Sheriff Carter Booth at 8. Carter is the Lamoille County Sheriff, 56 in his 3rd term, a man who had been one of my UVM undergraduates in horticulture in 1989 before he went to the Vermont Police Academy. Carter answered the phone himself. I told him in 2 minutes. He said, "Doc, I am leaving the office now. I will be at your gate by 9. I will bring the Criminal Investigations Unit. We will work the case as criminal mischief in the 1st degree under Vermont Statute Title 13, Section 3701, plus any applicable pesticide and water quality charges. I will personally interview Sienna this morning, Doc. I am very sorry." I thanked him. He hung up. By 9:30, my front pasture had 6 vehicles in it. Greta Norquist's white state agency truck, 2 Vermont Agency of Agriculture field technicians' trucks, a Vermont DEC officer's truck, Carter Booth's cruiser, and an unmarked sheriff's investigator vehicle with a detective named Cassandra Penrose at the wheel. By 11 a.m., they had photographed every affected shrub, taken 32 soil samples, taken 16 plant tissue samples, mapped the drift pattern with a GPS unit, and confirmed that drift had in fact reached the Brewster River tributary. The Vermont DEC officer, a young woman named Hayes Bauman, took water samples upstream and downstream of the tributary's confluence with the river. By noon, Cassandra Penrose had driven down to Lot 23, knocked on Sienna's door, and conducted a 40-minute interview during which Sienna denied any involvement and suggested the damage might be natural late-spring leaf burn. Cassandra had asked Sienna to identify her landscaper. Sienna had named a man, a contractor named Pace Whitfield, who ran a small lawn care business out of Morrisville, and Cassandra had driven straight from Sienna's house to Pace's shop. Pace Whitfield had cooperated within 90 seconds of being shown the search warrant. He had handed over his daily route log, his Roundup Pro-Max purchase receipts from the Morrisville Agway dated the previous Tuesday, and the text messages on his phone from Sienna Whitford Hollings, dated Wednesday at 1:11 p.m. The text read, in full, "Take care of the bushes today. Pay you cash next week. Make it stick." There were 31 prior text messages between them dating back 2 years. Cassandra Penrose photographed every one. While I waited for Eliza, I sat on the back porch and watched Greta and her field technicians work the corridor. The technicians wore Tyvek suits and respirators. They moved methodically, slow, the way good biologists move at a chemical site. They unrolled measuring tape, they photographed every meter, they cut samples of leaves and stems and soil into labeled glass vials. They wrote on the vials in pencil. They sealed the vials in evidence bags. They placed the bags in coolers with frozen ice packs. The whole operation looked, from my porch, like a small archaeological dig. Beatrix sat beside me on the porch step. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, quietly, "Theodore, the viburnum I planted the day Daddy died is the second one from the left. The second one from the left is gone." I told her I knew. We watched the technician on the second from left for 10 minutes. The technician took 6 samples. He labeled each one. He bowed his head, almost imperceptibly, when he was done. Beatrix saw it. She said, "Theodore, that young man is grieving for our hedge." I told her he was a student of Greta's. She had taught him to grieve at sample sites. Greta had been my student. The line ran 4 generations now of biologists who knew how to grieve at a dying plant. Beatrix said, "Good. Then it is not nothing." Eliza arrived from Burlington at 5:40. She walked the corridor with me and Beatrix. She did not speak for the full 90 minutes. When we returned to the kitchen, she sat down with her laptop, opened a fresh document, and began typing. She typed for 4 hours without stopping. By midnight, she had a 36-page memo that laid out the legal options. The criminal case was obvious. Sienna and Pace Whitfield were exposed to criminal mischief in the first degree, a felony up to 5 years, conspiracy to commit criminal mischief, willful destruction of private property, pesticide misapplication under Vermont Statute Title VI, Section 1115, and Federal Clean Water Act violations under 33 U.S. Code, Section 1319 for the drift into the river system. Civil damages for the destroyed corridor, given its documented research value, its NRCS cataloged pollinator value, and the cost of full replacement and 22 years of regrowth, Eliza calculated at $145,000. That was the obvious case. Eliza's memo, however, spent 28 pages on the less obvious move. She wrote, in the executive summary on page 2, "Dad, the criminal and civil case are going to happen and you will win them. The question is what you do at the property line. You can rebuild the hedges and accept that they will take 22 years to mature again, by which time you will be 93. Or you can build something that replaces the corridor's function immediately and prevents future drift permanently. I recommend the latter. I have a design idea. I asked her over breakfast the next morning what she meant. She said, "Dad, I want you to build a 60-foot wall." I asked her what kind of wall. She said a 20-foot tall vertical pollinator habitat, steel cable frame, cedar cladding, modular plant trays, drip irrigation, native climbing plants and shrubs, bee hotels every 6 feet, bat boxes at the top, designed by you and your old grad student Bram Northcote, permitted under Vermont's agricultural exemption to local zoning, registered as a federal NRCS pollinator conservation project, funded by the Wildlife Habitat Incentive Program at 50% cost share. It will not be a fence. It will not be a spite structure. It will be the largest single private pollinator restoration installation in Vermont. And, Dad, because it will sit along the south property line at 20 feet tall and 60 feet long, it will block every view from her north-facing windows and her north-facing deck. Permanently. Legally. Federally. I sat at the table for a long minute. Beatrix poured a fresh cup of coffee. Beatrix said, "Eliza, tell me you are not joking." Eliza said, "Mom, I am not joking." I called Bram Northcote at 8 a.m. Bram had been my doctoral student from 2003 to 2008. He had taken a tenure-track position at the University of Massachusetts, then resigned in 2015 to start a landscape restoration design firm in Northampton. He had built the largest private pollinator restoration installation in western Massachusetts, a 400-foot living wall along a former mill site in Holyoke for a private foundation in 2019. He answered the phone, listened for 6 minutes, laughed once, and said, "Theodore, tell Eliza she is brilliant. I will be in Stowe Friday morning. Get me a soil-bearing assessment. We will design this in a weekend. I can have it built by August." The next 60 days ran the way a careful project runs. Bram drove up with 3 of his designers. We laid out the structure on the south property line, a 60-foot run beginning at the same point where the original corridor had begun, set 6 feet inside our property line to allow for irrigation servicing access. The structure was designed as 8 modular bays, each 7.5 feet wide, each 20 feet tall. The steel cable frame would be set in 12 concrete footings, 4 feet deep. The cedar cladding would face north, toward our house, so that we would see warm wood from our porch. The plant face would face south, toward Mount Mansfield, so that the federal pollinator inspectors who would visit in the second year would see the largest single-site pollinator restoration in the state. Each bay would house 230 plants across 11 native species. Each bay would have 8 bee hotels, drilled hardwood blocks for mason bees and leafcutters, and 1 bat box at the top. Total plant count across the structure, 1,840 native plants across 84 species. Total bee hotel housing units, 64. Total bat box capacity, 8 maternity colonies. Greta Norquist personally walked the design with us in late May. She signed off on the Vermont Agency of Agriculture Pollinator Restoration designation in early June. She also submitted the federal NRCS application on our behalf, over my polite protest, and the NRCS approved a cost share of $48,000 against a total project budget of $122,000. Eliza filed the Lamoille County zoning notification under the Vermont Statute Title 24, Section 4413D, Agricultural Exemption. The town zoning administrator, a man named Otis Wakefield, who had volunteered with me on the Stowe pollinator pathway since 2014, approved the structure as agricultural in 2 business days. Bram's design carried one detail that I think the public response underappreciated, because it required a horticulturist to recognize it. The 84 species he and I selected were not random. They were chosen as a deliberate ecological sequence. The east end of the structure was planted with early spring bloomers, bloodroot, hepatica, dwarf cranesbill, native pussy willow, to support emerging queen bumblebees in April. The middle section was planted with midsummer bloomers, wild bergamot, Joe Pye weed, swamp milkweed, cardinal flower, gray-headed coneflower, to support midsummer butterflies and worker bees. The west end was planted with late-season bloomers, New England aster, smooth aster, goldenrod, witch hazel, autumn fern, to support fall migrating monarchs and male native bees searching for nectar before the first frost. The structure was, in other words, a deliberate phenological gradient, a left-to-right calendar of New England native bloom from April through October. Every visitor to the wall in its first season had a different favorite bay because they had visited in a different month. The school groups in May loved the east end. The retirees in July loved the middle. The Saturday volunteers in September loved the goldenrod glow on the west end. The structure was, by its design, a living almanac. Bram and I had been quietly proud of it during the design phase. The Vermont Pollinator Conservation Society named it the Project of the Year in 2025. We had not entered. The board had nominated us themselves. Sienna learned about the wall on the 14th of June. She filed a town zoning appeal that afternoon. She filed a Stowe Vista Estates HOA emergency motion the following day. She filed a Lamoille County Superior Court request for a temporary restraining order on the 17th. Eliza had drafted responses to all three before Sienna had filed any of them. The zoning appeal was denied by the Stowe Select Board at the first hearing. Otis Wakefield read into the record the Agricultural Exemption Statute and the Vermont Pollinator Protection Act, and the board upheld the permit 5-0. The HOA motion was meaningless because we were not in the HOA. The Superior Court request for a TRO was denied by Judge Eugenia Calloway on the 20th of June, in a written order that read in part, "Petitioner's claim of irreparable harm based on view diminishment fails as a matter of law, where the proposed structure is a permitted agricultural installation. Petitioner has identified no protected legal interest in the visual continuity of another landowner's south sky. The motion is denied." While the design was finalized, I documented the dying corridor as carefully as I had documented its living. I photographed every shrub every day for 30 days. I labeled each photograph with a date, a temperature, and a wind reading from Beatrix's anemometer. The browning followed the predictable cellular path of glyphosate damage, yellowing at the leaf margins, then a dry curl, then a complete defoliation, then the slow brown of the cambium beneath the bark as the plant gave up at the root. By the end of June, 41 feet of the original 60 had collapsed into bare wood and a slow gray rot at the soil line. I removed the dead material myself, with Beatrix's help, in early July. The work took 6 full days. The material filled 22 trash bags. We composted the lighter material at the back compost bin, where the kitchen scraps go. We hauled the rest to the town brush dump in 3 pickup loads. Beatrix did not speak much during the work. She had been gentle and patient at the beginning. By the last load, she had a fierce, small line in her jaw I had not seen since the summer her father died. I had not asked her about it. I knew. The corridor had been the place she had walked first thing in the morning for 23 years. The mornings between July of 2024 and the dedication in September were the only mornings in our marriage when she had nowhere to walk. She had stood at the kitchen window with her tea and watched the empty soil instead. I had watched her watching it. I had not said anything. Some grief belongs to the person who plants the first plant. Construction began on the 25th of June. The concrete footings were poured on the 2nd of July. The steel cable frame was raised on the 11th. The cedar cladding went on between the 24th of July and the 8th of August. The plant trays were installed between the 12th and the 29th of August. The first plants went in on the 2nd of September. By the 15th of September, the structure was fully planted. The total height, from ground to topmost bat box, was 20 feet and 4 inches. The total length along the property line was 60 feet exactly. The structure blocked every north-facing window of Sienna's house. The structure blocked her entire north-facing deck. The structure blocked her infinity pool's mountain view. The structure blocked the picture window in her primary bedroom. The structure blocked the bay window where she had a Peloton bike. The structure was, from the south side, a sheet of green and brown and cedar that did not move when she stood on her deck and pointed at it. The structure was, from the north side, the most beautiful piece of work I have ever helped build in 50 years of horticulture. Sienna filed a $1.2 million lawsuit in October for view-related property value diminishment. Eliza countersued under Vermont's anti-SLAPP statute on the same day, plus a separate claim for the criminal mischief damages. The countersuit demanded the original $145,000 in restitution, plus attorney's fees, plus a permanent injunction barring Sienna from applying or directing the application of any pesticide within 100 yards of our property line. The judge granted the injunction at the first hearing. The community response in those months was, looking back, the part I had not expected. Within a week of the corridor's death, 16 households along our road and from town had stopped by the property with food, with seedlings from their own gardens, with handwritten notes. The Wakefields brought a flat of arrowwood cuttings from their own corridor. The Pickerings brought 2 flats of swamp milkweed they had been growing for their own front pasture. The Stowe Garden Club, which Beatrix had volunteered with on and off for 15 years, sent a delegation of 7 women on a Saturday morning in late May with a card signed by 41 members. The card was a single sentence in the chair's hand. Dr. and Mrs. Sutcliffe, we are sorry, and we are with you. The Vermont Pollinator Pathway, of which I had been a charter board member since 2018, voted unanimously at their June meeting to dedicate their annual conference's poster session in 2025 to the rebuilding of our corridor. The Vermont Center for Eco-Studies in Norwich offered a free 3-year monitoring contract for the new structure. The Vermont Land Trust in Montpelier asked whether we would consider placing a conservation easement on the south 15 feet of our property to protect the new corridor in perpetuity. Eliza drafted the easement that fall. We signed it in November. The wall and its substrate are now permanently protected by federal-state easement against any future development, modification, or removal for as long as the property exists. The easement was filed on a Friday afternoon at the Lamoille County Registry. The recording slip is in our safe next to my father's logging deed and Beatrix's father's military citations. The criminal case against Sienna and Pace Whitfield ran through the fall. Pace took a plea in October. 6 months probation, $3,000 in restitution, and the suspension of his state landscape contractor license for 2 years. Sienna took a no-contest plea in December, a felony reduced to a misdemeanor on the criminal mischief count, $25,000 in restitution, 60 hours of community service at a Vermont fish and wildlife pollinator nursery in Berlin, and a permanent ban from serving on any Vermont Common Interest Community Board. The Vermont DEC issued separate civil penalties of $80,000 for the Clean Water Act drift to the Brewster River tributary. Sienna paid the penalty out of an account her husband Channing had separately walled off from her. She had no choice. The DEC funds went to the Vermont River Conservancy's tributary monitoring program. Channing Hollings filed for divorce on the 14th of December. He moved out of Lot 23 on the 22nd. He sent me a handwritten note in early January, on monogrammed letterhead, the same brand the Boeing director had used in the Washington case, with one sentence. Dr. Sutcliffe, I did not know about any of it. I am very sorry. I did not reply. Eliza filed the note in her case folder under Mitigating Decency. She keeps them all. She has 11 now across her practice. The wall was officially dedicated on the 28th of September at a small ceremony in our front pasture. Beatrix cut a length of indigo-dyed linen ribbon she had woven that summer. Greta Norquist spoke for 7 minutes about the design. Bram Northcote spoke for 4. The town zoning administrator, Otis Wakefield, read into the record the structure's official Vermont Pollinator Protection Project designation number, VPPP 2024-1147. The local UVM Extension Master Gardener chapter sent a delegation. Junie Chamberlain came in her county code enforcement uniform with her husband. Sheriff Carter Booth came in dress uniform with his deputy. Eliza brought 4 of her colleagues from the Burlington Environmental Bar. My grandchildren, Eliza's 2 boys, Auden and Felix, 8 and 5, cut their own ribbon at the base of the structure and planted the 1840th plant themselves, a single cardinal flower their grandmother had grown from seed. The wall was named the Beatrix Sutcliffe Native Pollinator Corridor at the dedication. Beatrix had not known. She cried when Greta read the plaque. She has cried twice since when visiting school groups have asked her about it. The first time, in October of 2024, a 4th grader from Linden Town School asked her what she had been thinking the day she planted the first viburnum. She told the class about her father, the heart attack in Connecticut, the funeral, coming home and planting the viburnum because she had not known what else to do. The teacher had not been prepared. Several of the children had cried. One quiet boy named August had asked whether he could plant a tree for his grandmother. Beatrix had told him yes. His mother emailed me 3 weeks later with a photograph of the shad bush he had planted. The shad bush is alive. It now stands the same height as a 6-year-old. We have it on the refrigerator. The structure became, within 12 months of the dedication, the largest documented private pollinator restoration installation in northern New England. UVM Extension cataloged 17 native bee species in the structure within 60 days of its completion. The monarch breeding count in 2025, the first full season after the wall, was 312 cocoons, a record for our property, surpassing the pre-poisoning 2023 count of 247. The Beatrix Sutcliffe Native Pollinator Corridor was featured in Yankee Magazine in March of 2025, the Burlington Free Press in April, Mother Earth News in June, and a peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Pollinator Conservation in September. School groups visit the structure on Tuesdays from May through October. Hannah Wakefield, Otis Wakefield's daughter, who was a 6th grade teacher at the Stowe Middle School, brought her class on a Tuesday in May. They counted 47 monarch caterpillars on the cardinal flower bays. One of her students, a quiet 11-year-old girl named Iris Pickering, asked me at the end of the visit whether she could come back on Saturdays in the summer to help with the bee hotels. I told her yes. She has been back every Saturday since June. She wants to be a pollinator ecologist. Greta Norquist has already written her a recommendation letter to the UVM Summer Field Program for high school students in 2026. Sienna's house went on the market in February of 2025. The listing did not mention the wall. The first buyer pulled out after a Saturday open house when the view of the wall caught him by surprise. The second buyer also pulled out. The third, a young family from Burlington named the Callaways, who had 3 small children and a dog, and who knew about the wall in advance and considered it a feature, purchased the property in May at $840,000, $260,000 below Sienna's purchase price 5 years earlier. Sienna moved to Florida. We do not know where. We have not heard from her since the criminal case closed. The Callaways came over for coffee the week they moved in. The mother, whose name is Hadley Callaway, stood at her own deck rail with our coffee mug in her hand, looked at the wall and said, "Dr. Sutcliffe, I want you to know we love this. Our daughters love this. Our son wants to know what kind of bees live in the bee hotels. Will you come over and teach them?" I told her I would come on Saturdays. I have, every Saturday since May. The civil damages settlement from Sienna funded an expansion. We added 2 additional bays at the east end in the spring of 2025, extending the structure to 75 feet. The Lamoille County Pollinator Demonstration Program, a county-funded education initiative, opened a permanent satellite site at our property in June. The annual visitor count in the first season was just under 400. UVM Extension uses the structure as a teaching site for the Master Gardener Certification Program. Bram Northcote's design firm has built 3 more vertical pollinator habitats across New England based on the design. One in Connecticut, one in New Hampshire, one in central Massachusetts, and credits our structure as the prototype. The Saturday volunteer roster at the Wall has grown into its own small community. Iris Pickering, the 11-year-old who came on her school field trip and asked to volunteer, has brought 2 of her classmates, a boy named Bennett Whitfield, no relation to the landscaper Pace, just a Vermont coincidence, and a girl named Calla Pemberton Tate. They arrive at 9 on Saturday mornings in pairs of muddy boots. They clean the bee hotels with a small drill bit Bram designed. They water the irrigation manifold. They write in a shared field journal Beatrix bought for them at the village stationer. Their handwriting changes month to month as they grow. By the end of the 2nd season, the journal had observations from 16 children, ages 8 to 15, across 47 Saturdays. The Vermont Land Trust placed a small bronze plaque on the east end of the Wall in October of 2025, designating it as an officially recognized Vermont Youth Conservation Site. Iris cut the ribbon. Her parents cried. So did Beatrix. So did I. Her teacher Hannah Wakefield brought the whole 6th grade for the ceremony. Hannah told her class before the cutting that they were standing in front of something a child could come back to as a grown-up and find still alive. Iris remembered the sentence. She quoted it in her UVM application essay 3 years later. She quoted it correctly. She was admitted in the early decision round. She arrived on campus the September after that with a copy of my green, Write in the Rain notebook tucked into her backpack, because I had given it to her at her high school graduation as a present she had not expected. The notebook fit. Some inheritances do. Beatrix walks the structure every morning at sunrise. She talks to the plants the way she talks to her weaving, quietly, by name, with the kind of attention only a person who has woven cloth for 40 years pays to a strand of fiber. The structure took the place of the hedges Beatrix had planted in 2001, the week her father died. The new structure is, in a way I did not expect when Eliza first described it to me, more her project than the original corridor ever was. She built the seedlings for half the 84 species in her studio. The studio is now also a small pollinator greenhouse. The weaving has been good. The seedlings have been good. The Beatrix-Sutcliffe native pollinator corridor is, I think, the most important piece of work either of us has been associated with in 50 years. If you have ever had a Karen kill what you planted for somebody you loved, leave a comment below. Tell me what she tried. Tell me what you did back. I read every one. The stories you send me are the reason I keep telling these. If this one warmed you, hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Next week, we've got a single mother in rural Indiana whose HOA Karen tried to tear down her son's swing set. There is a wedding video the Karen did not know was running. That story is coming Friday. In the meantime, plant something native. Read your county zoning. The agricultural exemption is older than her property line, and the bees do not care about her view. A short word about Pace Whitfield. Pace had been a landscaper in Lamoille County for 19 years. He had 3 kids in the Stowe Public Schools. His wife taught 2nd grade at the Morrisville Elementary School. Pace had not been a careful man, but he had not been a malicious one. He had taken Sienna's money because his business had been thin in early 2024, and the kids' braces had been due. He had not understood, until the sheriff knocked on his shop door, that the application he had been told was routine spot treatment was a felony assault on a federally cataloged pollinator restoration site. When he understood, he cooperated within 90 seconds. He pled out at the first opportunity. He served the probation. He paid the restitution out of his savings. He has since taken a Vermont Agency of Agriculture pesticide applicators training course at his own expense and works only with approved spot applications now. He sent me a handwritten letter in March of 2025 that said, in part, "Dr. Sutcliffe, I should have known better. I will not take an unverified work order again. I am very sorry for what I did to your wife's hedges. I wrote him back. I told him I accepted his apology. I told him I hoped his children's braces had come in straight. I have not heard back. I do not need to. The Beatrix Sutcliffe Native Pollinator Corridor, in its second full season, supported 428 monarch cocoons, 97 native bee species, and the first documented breeding pair of red-belted bumblebees, Bombus rufocinctus, a Vermont species of conservation concern, in Lamoille County since 2008. Greta Norquist wrote the agency report. The report ran 14 pages. The report named the wall twice. The report named Beatrix once. The report did not name me. I had asked Greta in advance to leave my name out. She had agreed. The wall is not mine. The wall is Beatrix's and Bram's and Eliza's and Iris Pickering's and the 43 school groups that have visited since the dedication. The wall belongs to the bees and the monarchs and the red-belted bumblebees and the second from left viburnum stump, which I left in the ground as a small memorial, the way you leave a chair empty at a long table. I sit on the back porch in the mornings now, with my coffee, and watch the wall in the early light. The cedar cladding has weathered into the silver gray of old Vermont barns. The plants on the south face change every 2 weeks. The bee hotels have been recolonized every spring without my intervention. The bat boxes have produced 2 confirmed maternity colonies. Beatrix walks the east to west path at sunrise. The grandkids walk it at noon when they visit. Iris walks it on Saturdays. The wall, in the language of 50 years of horticulture, is a stable, mature installation. In the language of marriage, it is the second corridor Beatrix and I have built together, and it is the better one. Some grief becomes a structure. The structure outlives the grief. That is the story of Holcomb's Rest.
First, this one is about something the law gets right more often than we give it credit for. Sienna Whitford Hollins looked at 23 years of pollinator habitats and saw an obstruction. She did not see what the rest of us see when we slow down. A small piece of careful work that fed something larger than her view of Mount Mansfield. Teddy Sutcliffe did not win because he was angrier than her. He won because he had a college at UVM Extension, a daughter at the Burlington Environmental Bar, a federal pollinator program with a checkbook, and a Vermont agricultural exemption older than Sienna State. The lesson, friends, is that ecology is a kind of law, habitat is a kind of right. If you have ever had a Karen kill what you planted for somebody you love, leave a comment below and tell me your story. I read everyone. They remind me we are not alone. Hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Next week, a single mother, a swing set, and a wedding video coming Friday.